know this creature, Sasquatch. And as with our earlier presentations, we will be having a panel, a response panel this afternoon in the Bonner Room from 1 until 2:30. Our speaker, Mr. Green, has told me that at that time, after the response panel, he will be showing a video of an interview with Bob Gimlin, who was present at the filming of the very famous movie about Sasquatch made in 1967. So you may want to be certain to make it to the panel. Of course, that's your opportunity to have more one-on-one discussion with our speaker. This morning, our speaker, John Willison Green, is going to discuss a creature that has fascinated humans from about 2000 BC, where there are hints of a Sasquatch-like animal in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, with the hairy creature Enkidu. Also, Greek mythology abounds with stories about hairy bipeds. And one of my favorite stories, Beowulf, which is an Anglo-Saxon epic written maybe about the 8th century AD, might even have as the nemesis of Beowulf, that is Grendel and his mother, as Sasquatches. So this creature has fascinated human beings from time recorded literally to the present. In his book, Sasquatch, The Apes Among Us, Mr. Green has reported over 1,500 sightings of Sasquatch in every state in the Union except Hawaii and Rhode Island, and in every Canadian province except Nova Scotia. This creature, who has fascinated humans for so long, has the names from A to Z, literally, from Abominable Snowman to Zana, with names like Bigfoot, Kaptar, Momo, Sasquatch, Human, and Mr. Green's favorite, Woolly Booger, from the South, just to name a few. Our speaker, John Green, is a preeminent authority on the fascinating question of whether North American continent shares our primate stance here with another primate, a hairy biped. He has researched this topic for over 35 years and has assembled a file of over 2,000 reports on the sightings. He is a graduate of the University of British Columbia, School of Journalism, in fact, and has been a newspaperman for nearly 50 years. He's therefore uniquely qualified as a chronicler of the events and investigations into this interesting creature. Between 1968 and 1973, he wrote 3 very short volumes, primarily concerned with events on the Pacific Coast, On the Track of the Sasquatch, Year of the Sasquatch, and the Sasquatch File. And they are now standard reference works in this particular field. He has spent a great deal of time exploring the phenomenon of Sasquatch in the Pacific Northwest. In his book, Sasquatch, The Apes Among Us, he even lists state by state, and of course there's a chapter on Idaho and Montana, which I think you'd find fascinating, which demonstrates sightings throughout the United States, but focusing, as I said, recently on this area. I think it is not only ironic but fitting that Mr. Green is addressing us today on April Fool's Day. And that's not meant to be a joke, because in reality, it was 37 years ago on April 1st, 1955, that John Green wrote his first article about Sasquatch. He had just bought a newspaper in Agassiz, British Columbia, which serves the Harrison area, and he wrote an article in which he detailed how a beautiful guest at the Harrison Hot Springs Hotel had been carried off in the mountains by a hairy monster. Now, he didn't think at the time that anyone would look at it as more than a joke. However, in 1958, when British Columbia was looking for a way to celebrate its 100th anniversary, the government decided that it would celebrate by having a Sasquatch hunt. And that celebration has triggered a series of events that has led John Green into a lifetime of investigating the phenomenon of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Will you please welcome Mr. Green?
Thank you. This is certainly qualifies as one of the mysteries of our time, but I still feel a little out of place because what I'm dealing with is something that is really rather ordinary. It's just an animal. I note that all the other subjects are things that humans really aren't equipped to deal with, or that if you, in the case of the UFOs, if we ever caught up with them, they would probably deal with us. But, and there are people who are in this same field that I am who tend to link the Sasquatch with flying saucers or what they call time warps or fourth dimensions. Concepts that I've certainly seen the words, but I don't understand any meaning they might have. But as far as I'm concerned, what I have been investigating is simply an animal. And you've already been given some explanation of how I got involved. That when we had this Sasquatch hunt going on, we got a lot of publicity. I discovered that there were people whom I already knew in this small community that I moved to, because I grew up in the city. People I already knew and respected who had serious stories to tell. And having been a newspaperman by that time for about 10 years, I was accustomed to interviewing people, and I'd also covered a lot of court proceedings, listened to testimony, and thought I had a pretty good idea of when people were telling the truth. And these people seemed absolutely serious. And one weekend I ran into, from two different directions, this story of an incident that had taken place in 1941, where a woman had come running down the railway track to where a section gang was working. Younger people may not know what a section gang is, but the railroads used to be maintained by small parties of men who were stationed just a few miles apart along the track. And this woman's husband was a member of this gang, and she came and told them that a monster, which she called a Sasquatch. I mean, she was an Indian and she was familiar with the term, and she knew what she'd seen. Had come to the house where she lived, an isolated house on a small Indian reserve. The whole section gang went back there and they found these enormous tracks crossing the vegetable garden and actually crushing the potatoes in the ground. Now, over a period, I got to talk to 4 people who had been there at that time. They all agreed on one thing, that there were tracks where the thing had crossed the railroad. The railroad fence was at least 4 feet high, and the tracks indicated that this thing had simply stepped over it. And, okay, now, this is just stories. This was actually 1957. But in 1958, there was some publicity from Northern California, this is where the term Bigfoot originated, that something had been leaving huge footprints on a road under construction, an access road going into a logging area where there had been no roads before. And by this time I got sufficiently intrigued with these stories that I just got in my car and went down there. And I had to keep asking directions because the little town that was referred to in the story wasn't on the map. And I found the closer I got, the more explanations there were. The sheriff had determined, always seemed to be the sheriff, and we don't have this type of sheriff in Canada, so it was kind of interesting that our sheriffs are just court officers. But the sheriff said that it was an Indian boy who was insane and had been kept chained up and had escaped. And another place the sheriff said it was just false feet you could buy in any joke shop. Really, we would have got discouraged and stopped, except that we've been exposed to some of this type of thing before at home. And anyway, when we got to the right area, they said, sure, these tracks were there, and a fellow said he'd take us up there in the morning. So we followed this logger driving a pickup, and we couldn't keep up with him, so time we got to where the work was, he'd been there a while, and he came back. He said, sorry, you know, he said, they just backbladed all that stuff this morning. And we thought, oh yeah, what do you expect? And then he said, well, just look around. He said, you'll find some, there's lots of them around here. And so we got out of the car, and there was a track on the shoulder of the road right beside the car. And the first time you see one of these tracks, you know, you've got something real. Sure, a track itself is an odd sort of thing. It's just a shape in the ground. It isn't really anything. But on the other hand, something alive must have been there to make it. And there are really only two choices. Either there is something with a foot like that, or else humans have deliberately manufactured these things. And that's where I got hooked on the subject, and for the past 35 years, because I was a young man when it started, and now I'm due for the old age pension, I've been investigating what makes the track. And approximately 10 years later, there was another development which was, although this whole thing certainly does not depend on it, nevertheless is far greater, more significant than anything else that's happened. Two men down in the same area of Northern California where I first saw tracks took a movie of something walking across a sandbar. And this, I expect nearly all of you will have seen it in a TV commercial, if nothing else, but it is a very heavily built, very dark, hair-covered creature with obvious breasts that is striding along, not really fast, but with long steps across this sandbar. And the movie is somewhat blurred, and it's a very short segment. But this one incident far outweighs any other. There were two witnesses, and multiple witnesses are always better than a single witness. There were tracks which were made at, you know, they saw the thing make the tracks, but disregarding their story entirely, there were very good tracks there, very fresh, which were cast. I have a copy of one of those casts here. And of course, there's the movie itself. Now, most of you are probably under the impression that scientists have studied that movie and rejected it. The fact of the matter is that they have rejected it, but they haven't studied it. It's a very interesting reaction. There's no such thing as a big upright ape walking around in North America. Therefore, anything tending to show that there is fake. Therefore, as a scientist, I'm not going to get involved with a fake. So it's a perfect circle, and there's no way to break into it. And despite the fact that there has been some study of that film done in Russia and also in England, in both cases by people in the field of biomechanics, experts who study the motion of the mechanics of living creatures, and specifically men, humans. The Russians said that this was unquestionably not a human, that a human couldn't walk that way. The Englishman said that it depended on the speed at which it was filmed, which is not known. That if it, at one speed it could be a human, at another speed it couldn't. But in neither case did they suggest that this is an obvious fake. Now, I have myself been to the Disney organization, and they have told me that they could not build something to walk across that sandbar, and that in fact they could not create that effect in any way except by drawing it. And they had studied the movie. Since that time, I have seen many efforts by Hollywood to represent one of these things in film, Here we have a movie that was taken by a couple of sort of cowboy types from Yakima, which is infinitely better than anything that Hollywood has been able to create. And we're supposed to believe that they faked it. In any event, that's the best evidence. Perhaps I would put in the next category something that happened right here in Idaho. The head of the chief inspector of the Humane Society in Ontario, which is the largest province in Canada, was out here just driving on a road near Weiser. I hope I've pronounced that somewhere near correctly. This is a man with a background in military intelligence and also a man who has handled the great apes in the course of his work with the Humane Society. The only weakness of this account is that there's only the one witness. But he came around a curve in the road up in the mountains above Weiser. That got a full account here if anyone was interested. And encountered two human-sized, not very heavy, and this is not a typical description, hair-covered creatures standing on the road. And he came very close to them, and not at a high speed, and in good light. And they went up the cut bank beside the road, which was about 6 feet high, and one of them did it in a standing high jump. Just took off from 2 feet and landed on 2 feet on the top. So here we have a man who cannot be dismissed as not being a qualified witness, which is, again, what's done to discount most of these stories. Describing a creature doing something that no human in a suit, and indeed no human athlete ever born, could attempt. To land on 2 feet, 6 feet up, taking off without any run at all, just straight up. So, here's a case. Either this man was struck temporarily insane, or he's lying, or we have a description of an animal doing something that no human could imitate. Now, I realize I've just given you just a couple of glimpses of what this is all about, but to try to cover this subject systematically, well, it would literally take a couple of days. And so what I usually do is just open it up, and then I ask for questions, and that way I'll be talking about things that I know that at least somebody in the audience is interested in. So if it's all right with you, that's the way we'll do it. Anybody got a question? Yes? Nothing to indicate that they're dangerous. The common understanding is that anywhere in North America you can go by yourself into the woods without any weapons, and although there are a number of animals there that could indeed kill you quite easily, it's something that happens so rarely that we don't even weigh it. Now, if these things are there, they've been there all along, and it's no more dangerous now than it was before. So there's every indication that they just avoid people. They're not dangerous at all. Yes? The most reports combining footprint and sighting reports right here, next door here in Washington. Also a great many in California, but more footprint reports than sighting reports. British Columbia also a great many reports. And then in recent years, since the interest that movie stirred up has died down, we actually get very few reports from out here on the West Coast. But there are various states back east where, for reasons I don't very well understand, because of course I've not investigated back there, there are still a lot of reports. Currently Ohio, for instance, there's quite a lot of reports. Florida, there have been a great many, but not recently. I think the western states are still ahead, but some of those in the east are gaining fast. Yes? Nearly all of the ones that are reported appear to be male, and nearly always they're alone. So basically it would seem to be a solitary situation in which the males take more risks of being seen than the others. There is actually a pattern that would achieve that. The orangutan, so each of the great apes has a different lifestyle, so to speak. The orangutan, the males are territorial, the females are not. So the females can all congregate in a limited area, or taking this case, they could stay where they will be out of sight. Males, on the other hand, from time to time are forced to find a territory. So this could account for these things wandering, and sometimes right into civilization. Just a few years back, we had a whole series of sightings and footprints in Bellevue, right? The built-up area now near Seattle. I just mentioned one other outstanding case, though, where there was a group together, a male, a female, and a small one. And this was a logger who'd wandered off trying to keep warm on a cold day when he was supposed to be swamping behind a cat and he wasn't needed. And there was a lot of freezing rain and ice falling off the trees, making a lot of noise, which may have account for the observation he was able to make. And he came out of the trees and noticed some movement, stopped, and saw these three things picking up rocks. And the male eventually dug a deep hole and dug out some hibernating rodents. And they all ate them. But he noticed that the small one always kept the female between it and the male. So he rather wondered whether this actually was a family group, or whether it was a case that the male was interested in the female and the young one was afraid of the male. Another thing from that, just last fall, I was taken by a retired wildlife biologist in Oregon up into that same area. And since his retirement, he's made a hobby of looking for these holes in the rock, and he's found about 20 of them. And all of them are older than this one. This incident happened 25 years ago. Now, obviously, if we're talking about a population of creatures, they've been here for thousands of years. If we're talking about even several hundred holes in rock piles, this is not something they do all the time. It's a very, very rare thing for them to do. But he has found, as I say, 20 more of these holes. And the fact that they are all older is significant, because the one that was made 25 years ago, the growth of moss and the discoloration of the rocks has advanced very little. So that these older ones would go back before there were white people in the country. So that, you know, if you're thinking of mining activity or of a deliberate hoax, and a hoax would be pretty hopeless because some of these rocks must weigh 200 or 300 pounds. We're going back when the snow is gone this spring and do some weighing and measuring just to pin this down. But certainly everybody that's seen one of these holes, they immediately say, well, no human could do it. It's just, the rocks are just too big. Anyhow, that's what happens when I answer questions. I get digressing all over the place. Yes? Oh, excuse me. Oh, okay. Yes? Question was, do I know how big they can get? Well, there are people who have made estimates as high as 15 feet tall, which is out of the question. I don't know. My opinion is that 8 to 10 feet would be a big one, or an adult male. Another thing, I was asked to hold these cast up. This is a cast approximately 15 inches long and 8 inches across the ball. It's one of about 500 footprints walking down a road under construction on a ridge in Northern California. It's made in deep dust. And it's not a particularly good cast, but the reason that I show this one is that I was there and I made the cast myself. There are other people who have much better casts, but you know, I can't vouch for them in the same way. There were 2 of these at least together. This 13-inch track was on the same road as the 15-inch track. Of course, I can't say they were actually walking together, but they were both walking in the same place. There may have been a third. The man who found the track said there were 3 sizes of track, but by the time I got there 24 hours later, there had been traffic on the road under construction, and all the tracks that were in the area where the wheel marks were, of course, had been wiped out. I counted 590 some tracks, but there probably were well over 1,000 originally. Another interesting thing about them is that they'd all been made within a very short time, because it had been very hot, very dry, but there was one brief shower the evening before. And all the tracks had been made at a time when there was a little bit of mud on the top of the dust, which I would imagine would have dried out within a half an hour. This other one may appear to be about the same as the last one I held up, but it's slightly larger, and this is a copy of one of the tracks that was cast on the sandbar where the movie was made. I'll leave those there when this hour is over. They tell me there's no one else in the auditorium, and anyone that wants to come up and have a look at them is welcome. Yes? Well, there's a great variation there. They can come as much as 10 feet apart. But in the case of these that we're apparently just walking down the road, it was a range of 4 to 4.5 feet. Yeah. As a question that never heard of anyone finding a carcass, that's quite correct. And that is what makes this one of the great mysteries. If any part of a carcass should ever be found, that will settle the matter. And I cannot give you any good explanation of why nothing has been found. It's extremely unlikely. It's true that bones are not often found in this part of the world. They're eaten or they rot. You don't find bones of animals that have died a natural death. Very rare thing to do. But still, it's not a sufficient explanation of why it should never happen. Personally, I expect it will happen. I expect it probably has happened, but nothing that came to be identified.
I believe I read your book there that there's been numerous times hair has been found from this animal, though, and it cannot be identified as any other animal hair. And could you tell us a story about the one that was captured by a Sasquatch taken up into the mountains? That was your book, wasn't it?
Okay, the question about hair. Hair that people at the scene have thought came from one of these things has been collected probably dozens of times. The problem for many years was that you couldn't do anything with it except compare it with known hairs in a comparison microscope. Since nobody had any identified Sasquatch hairs, the best you could hope for is, here's hair we can't identify. which has indeed happened. But obviously there would be thousands, perhaps even millions of different hair samples you might potentially have, numerous ones that would differ off even an individual animal. So, the time and the collection to make a comparison with simply wouldn't exist to say we've eliminated everything else, we got something new. Now that situation's changing. With DNA research and with immunology research along that line, we're very hopeful that the time has already come when it would be possible to say, here we have the hair of a higher primate, but not one of the known ones. And indeed, that has almost happened. A sample from Northern California, which had been gathered one hair at a time, following through the bush where it was thought one of these men felt he was trailing one of these, was studied by what's known as radioimmunoassay by Dr. Gerald Lowenstein at the University of California, at their hospital in San Francisco. He claims to be able to identify blood stains on prehistoric scrapers, for instance. He can tell you what animal was scraped 30,000 years ago. That's how fine an identification is possible by this system. He also says that, and I've seen this now starting to show up in books, that this has proved that chimpanzees are more closely related to us than they are to gorillas. In other words, that the gorillas split off first and then the humans and the chimps divided at a later date. Okay, he analyzed this hair, and his answer was it is either chimpanzee, gorilla, or human. I can't tell which. Which to me says it's pretty close, but I haven't got it. And it would be easy to then take some of the hair and check it against those three possibilities, but the trouble is that in trying to get enough water-soluble protein out of it, he ground the whole thing up. So we have to get some other hair and let him do it again, and this time save some so that we can do that check afterwards. But I have handled that sample myself. It certainly wasn't human hair. Most of it was wool hairs, which are pretty rare in the human, and the guard hairs, the long, heavier hairs, were pointed. Human hairs are not pointed. Human hair grows indefinitely and it's cut off at the ends. So it certainly wasn't human hair. So, well, how many gorillas and chimpanzees go wandering through the forests in Northern California? I'm sorry, I've forgotten the other part of it.
Well, you mentioned, I think it was in your book that...
Oh, about the man who was taken prisoner?
Taken prisoner, carried out into the mountains, miles and miles.
Yes, very early in this, when I got involved with this man came forward who said that one of these things had picked up his sleeping bag with him in it and dumped him out in a little box canyon away up in the mountains after carrying him for a good part of the night. And that there were a family of these things there, an adult male, adult female, a fairly full-grown male, and a smaller female. Today, a story like that I wouldn't listen to for a minute. The problem with that one is that he went against the popular conception that the Sasquatch had a lot of publicity in British Columbia over quite a long period, from write-ups by a man who was a school teacher on an Indian reserve. The public image we were dealing with was of a giant Indian with long hair. And in those days, men didn't have long hair, so the hairy giant was just a human of an immense size, lived in villages, had signal fires on the mountains, all this kind of thing, and long hair on the head. This man described 4 apes. And he didn't think there were apes. He was a Swedish logger, and not an educated man. He thought they were some kind of human. I took a man who, from the University of Washington, who was doing an atlas of comparative anatomy of man and other primates, and the veterinarian from the primate center there, who was also the veterinarian for the great apes in the Seattle Zoo. They questioned this man all afternoon. They told me afterwards, and I've got the whole thing on tape, that he never slipped up once, that everything that he described was exactly what it should be for an ape that walked upright, an ape not like the other apes, which are quadruped, basically. How an uneducated Swedish logger could do that if he hadn't seen the thing some way, you still got to take it seriously, despite the fact that the rest of the story is so unbelievable. The man is long dead now, so there's no way to follow it up any further. Something that occurred to me a minute ago when we were discussing the matter of bones, there is a possible ancestor for these things that is well known. It's called Gigantopithecus. It's known from hundreds of teeth and from 4 lower jaws that have been found, one of them in India, but nearly everything else in southern China, dated as recently as 300,000 years ago. And the jaw bones are twice as big as those of the biggest gorilla. And they're of a wide V shape, where the other apes have a U-shaped jaw, quite narrow at the back. A physical anthropology professor over at Washington State has done a reconstruction of the head that would be required to use this jaw. I think actually he's had it here when he's talked at this college. But in any event, his opinion is that this wide rear to the jaw indicates that the spinal column came up into the bottom of the skull instead of to the back of the skull as in the other apes, which would mean that this thing walked upright. So you have a perfectly suitable ancestor. And the curious thing about that is there is no ancestor for the gorilla. If gorillas weren't here now, there would be no evidence that they had ever existed. I'm taking too many questions at the front because I can't see very well at the back. Somebody want to holler out from over there? Well, here.
In some of the sightings, there have been many variations in colors, and I was wondering if I read white-haired ones and black-haired and brown, grayish brown. Does that mean subspecies within that, or is it just a variation of the average and coloration of species as well?
Question about the many different colors that have been described. The variation isn't much different from what you find in what we loosely term black bears. Most of them are black, but in BC we have some that are white, and you get colors all the way from a brown that's almost yellow to a rich chocolate brown. So although that's unusual, there's nothing impossible about it. In China they have a hairy wild man that they actually had a more extensive search for than has ever been done in North America. Even the Red Army got involved about 10 years ago. And they're red-haired, and yet the footprint casts from there are identical, other than that they're different individuals to the footprint casts we get in North America. Yes?
What kind of technology is used to look for this?
What kind of technology? Well, that opens an enormous subject, because if scientific institutions with people with the proper training and access to the proper equipment and the funds to do this research as it should be done had ever been involved, I'm sure I wouldn't be here and that the whole thing would have been solved long ago. There has been no research with anything but the efforts of amateurs with whatever equipment they could pull together. This brings me to something I would like to say. Over the years, I've come to find that I've accepted the existence of an animal, and if you think about it, it's really not a very unusual animal. It's nothing like as unusual as an elephant or a giraffe or a kangaroo. That's easy to understand, except that for some reason we don't know about it, and the reason we don't know about it appears to lie with us, not with the behavior of the animal. You see one, just try telling somebody. That's the problem. Information doesn't circulate or accumulate in any proper way because it's rejected, and people who claim to have any are ridiculed. We seem to have a problem with these things. And it goes this far, that as I said early on, these footprints have to be made by something living. And this has been going on, as was indicated in the introduction, throughout recorded history. This whole phenomenon, not the footprints so much specifically mentioned, but the hairy giant type thing. So either we have an animal that would be of tremendous interest to us because it would be the only other animal that walks like us and would be a near relative. Or we have some absolutely fascinating human activity that has never been researched. So any major institution should be able to put together a team of zoologists and cultural anthropologists or psychologists or whatever discipline they wanted to go to on the human side, and put some real resources, some real expertise into investigating all this material that the amateurs have assembled. And it's a no-lose situation. One side or the other is going to come up with an earth-shattering piece of research. Can't lose. And all the digging has been done. But they won't touch it. Nobody will touch it. It's absolutely verboten. And this is really the thing that fascinates me more than the animal. Why do we react like this? Anyone at the back that I've been missing?
You said that.
Yes?
Have they ever found any fecal matter or anything from one, or anything other than hair?
Fecal matter has been, just asking if there's been any fecal matter. Droppings. Yes, that sort of material has been collected, but we found that it isn't any use. That all I can tell you is what this thing was eating and what kind of parasites it had. And some of the answers we've had have been quite suggestive, but they don't prove a thing. I think you had a question before, didn't you? Okay. How long do they live? No, I have no idea. The only thing I can say definitely is that the large footprint there was first, that's a very recognizable individual, that print, was first seen in 1958. The cast I have there was made in 1967, so it was full size in 58 and still there in 67, but that's as far as I can go. Yes?
In regards to the fact that when your skeletons the possibility that they could be
A question whether it's possible that they bury their dead. I don't think anything else in their behavior indicates that they would come that close to having a culture, but I couldn't say it's impossible. Yes.
What about dogs? I never understood why these animals can't track the dogs.
The chief problem with trying to track them with dogs is to get fresh enough prints to put, to have dogs available and learn of tracks soon enough to get the dogs on it. That's exactly what I was trying to do when we made these casts of the ones on the road. They were only 24 hours old, but by the time I got there with the dog by airplane, because the dogs I had lined up were in British Columbia, or the individual dog, it was dark. The dog reacted almost as if you'd given it an electric shock. Just stiffened and his hair stood up. But somehow or other, nobody was willing to follow the tracks in the dark. We came back the next morning at daylight, and the dog showed no interest. And it started going to the side of the road and sniffing at the little bushes. And the dog handler said that that's the last place where a scent would hang, and that he guessed it wasn't looking too promising. And the dog took us off that road where you could see the tracks, down an old Jeep road that was hard-packed where you couldn't see anything. But it came to nothing. And that's the closest I know of that anyone has been able to get a dog on a fresh set of tracks. People who have tried it with hounds tell me, I've never been directly involved, that hounds won't follow these tracks, which is understandable on two counts. Hounds are generally trained to reject anything but the tracks that their owners want them to follow. And the other thing is that there is ample evidence that dogs are afraid of these things instinctively, terrified. That the kind of dogs that you'd think would tackle anything will go and hide under the house. Which is very interesting in another way, because our dogs got their instincts in the old world, not in North America. So if this thing has a scent that terrifies dogs, they learned that over tens or hundreds of thousands of years, whatever it takes, somewhere in Eurasia. Yes?
I listened to Dr. France, University of Washington, talk on the subject right here tonight. Dr. France advocates that anybody has to see one of those things, that possibly to end the mystery. As a hunter, for example, would you advocate killing one of these animals if someone had the opportunity?
As long as they were certain it wasn't a person in a suit, yes. And I know that's becoming increasingly not only an unpopular, but even a dangerous opinion to hold. But there's no possibility that, that you asked whether I would advocate shooting one. These are not an endangered species. I mean, they're literally being reported worldwide. If all the reports are true, they're the most widespread animal there is, other than man and the animals that depend on man. So, and to be a continuing population, even here in Western North America, considering the immense area from Alaska down to California, you're talking tens of thousands. Grover's estimate, granted, was much lower than that, but I think he's, grizzly bears are supposed to be endangered. We've got 20, 30,000 of them in British Columbia. Also, there's no way that they could be considered some kind of human, and this is another popular, if you want to be speaking on this subject and be popular with your audience, these are the things you say, that, you must never, it would be unthinkable to shoot one because they're some kind of human, or on the other hand, they're some kind of endangered species. There's no evidence for either position. We became what we are through a very long evolution of depending on our intelligence and depending on acting in groups. these things are the master of their environment physically. They're stronger than anything else around, except maybe an Alaska brown bear. And remember that we haven't got any proof that these exist. But the minute that it is established that they do exist, we know a lot about them because we've got thousands of people who have described seeing them doing things. And one of the things they can do is run fast enough to catch a deer. So, this is a thing that has responded to its environment strictly in physical terms. And it will have a great big brain because it's a great big higher primate. But a gorilla has a pretty big brain and it lives basically the life of a cow. And this thing is living basically the life of a bear. And when somebody tells you that they communicate with humans by mental telepathy and that they're some kind of noble savage, that, this is the kind of thing that humans dream up. You'll see people on the television who've been called on to debunk somebody like me that has actually done some research. And they'll say that humans have an ingrained need to imagine monsters. Well, I challenge that one because I want to know, why does this ingrained need to imagine monsters dry up where there's less than 20 inches of rain a year? And the map of Sasquatch reports will correlate extremely well with the contour line for 20 inches of rain a year in North America. But anyway, one thing that does seem to be ingrained in humans is to try to imagine something better than us that's not been civilized and has all of the nasty aspects of human civilization. So they're trying to pin this on the poor old Sasquatch. It's Rousseau's noble savage all over again. But there's just nothing for that. This is strictly an animal. And in the interest of the animal itself, not here in the Pacific Northwest where we only pass through its habitat and modify it when we log an area, but as I expect everybody in Idaho knows, when you clear cut an area, you're not destroying that from the point of view of wildlife. Over the course of the cycle, you may even be improving the situation for wildlife. So we're not going to do anything to them here, but in Florida, for instance, they may very well require protection from the real estate industry. And it's pretty hard to halt real estate development in the name of an imaginary animal. So, no, I don't think you'll find that's correct if you look into it. No, I follow these things. There's various people have sought publicity by announcing, but the only place that has something that I know of is the Washougal County, and as a county ordinance, it's meaningless. I mean, so it's clearly beyond the bounds of anything a county could legislate. Okay, I'm told this is the last question.
Have you, in your research, uncovered any bona fide hoaxes? How elaborate have those been?
Yes, I've been the victim of a very elaborate hoax, as a matter of fact. There are certainly hoaxes. I think I've been the victim of 2 elaborate hoaxes. There have been some very elaborate hoaxes. One thing there has never been is a set of footprints such as these I've got up here, where the people who have studied this seriously were firmly of the opinion that these were genuine footprints. Nobody has ever been able to come forward and show that they made them, or show how they could be made. But yes, there have been lots of hoax footprints, and I've made some myself in the course of trying to find out what happens when you put carved feet on a pair of boots and walk and run and carry heavy weight and so on. And there, of course, will have been numerous people who will have told stories that were not true. Wasn't that way in the beginning, when nobody knew about this? If I would hear about footprints, if I went there would be footprints. because nobody would mistake something miscellaneous for a footprint, and nobody would know to be faking them. And in the same way, if you heard even a rumor of a sighting report, you could pretty well count on it. If you started digging into it, it would get solider and solider until you got to the person who told you the actual story. But nowadays it's quite the opposite. The odds are that if you hear of something and you look into it, it'll peter out or it'll be fake. So sure, but there's this to remember. Somebody gets up and says, well, 50% of the stories are made up or mistaken. Most of them would just be mistaken. Or 75% or 25%. That's not the way it works. Either there is an animal or there isn't. If there is an animal, then probably most of the stories are accurate. Just as when somebody says they saw a bear crossing the road, they probably saw a bear crossing the road. If there isn't an animal, then none of the stories are correct. So I would say, I believe, I'm satisfied from investigation, that it's far more difficult to explain all this away without the animal than it is if you assume that there is an animal. The problem is just that we haven't ever collected a piece of one. But if there is an animal, then probably most of the people who reported seeing it did indeed see it. And a lot of the stories that have no good explanation, such as what is it that will throw a dog against the owner's house, and the dog has no scratch marks, but it's dead because the impact broke half its bone. That is certainly described. I've never been there when it happened, but I've had several people tell me that this happened to their dog. That's not evidence that there are Sasquatches, but if you prove there are Sasquatches, that they, of course, immediately become the best explanation. Anyway, I'm wandering off again, and I guess I'm supposed to stop.
Please do remember the response panel in the bottom room at 1 o'clock, and Mr. Green will be